1994 was a busy year for id Software. Not only was the studio still riding the massive success of Doom, it found itself at the centre of a frenzy as outside companies looked to grab a slice of that Doom hype. Movies, comics, developers looking to use the engine, interview requests, eager fans, and much more. On top of this, they had the small thing of trying to develop a sequel for the game that had to be released in time for the holiday period of 1994. So of course, when your plate is full, why not put a bit more on it? Atari were having their own fun after releasing the Jaguar console in late 1993, and seeing how Doom had arrived to such massive hype, they approached id Software with a simple premise: bring Doom to the Jaguar home console. With Atari willing to pay $250,000 to make it happen, and John Carmack personally overseeing the port's development, the stars aligned and Jaguar owners were set to receive the first home console release of Doom. Of course, it wouldn't end up being the first home console port released. That honour would fall to the Sega 32X version, which released a week earlier, but for Jaguar fans that didn't matter. They just wanted to be able to take the Doom experience and put it in their home console. This is Doom on the Atari Jaguar. Atari were one of the biggest names in video games through the late 1970s and 1980s, developing consoles like the Atari 2600, 5200 and 7800. The company also experimented with dedicated handheld gaming, releasing the Atari Lynx in 1989. Atari was one of the many companies though blamed for contributing to the 1983 video game crash, an event that saw poor quality games being overproduced by many video game manufacturers. Poor home console ports like Pac-Man and E.T. contributed a lot to the damage of Atari's wider brand and reputation, eventually leading to the video game market bottoming out. These games specifically were not to blame for the crash, but they did contribute to it. By the 1990s, the company had failed to regain its position within the video games industry. Sega and Nintendo had risen in the shadow of the video game crash to become the market leaders. In 1989, Atari began development on two different home consoles, the Panther and the Jaguar. The intention was for the Panther to release first using a 16-bit or 32-bit architecture and then be joined by a more powerful Jaguar console a few years later. As development continued on the Jaguar, development actually overtook the Panther and it became clear that there was no need for two home consoles. In 1991, the Panther's development was shuttered and all focus shifted to the Jaguar. The Jaguar console targeted high performance compared to the existing consoles. It used a complex internal spec that saw it come with two processors working in unison, both named Tom and Jerry. In the years after the Jaguar console's release, many video game developers were highly critical of this technical setup, feeling the platform was complicated to program for and didn't allow game developers easy access to the console's raw power, something John Carmack himself would comment on in the years after the release of Doom on the Jaguar. The console would also be cartridge-based, although an add-on called the Jaguar CD would be released in September 1995. This would add CD capabilities to the platform, but only a handful of games ever made use of it. In an attempt to outshine their competitors, Atari stated in advertising that the console was 64-bit, however this has been widely disputed. Both of the processors, Tom and Jerry, and the system processor operated at a 32-bit level. Electronic Gaming Monthly commented on this at the time, stating, "If Sega did the math for the Sega Saturn the way Atari did the math for their 64-bit Jaguar system, the Sega Saturn would be a 112-bit monster of a machine." The Jaguar would be officially unveiled in August 1993 at the Chicago Consumer Entertainment Show. The console was officially launched several months later, releasing on 23rd of November 1993 for a price of $249.95 in the US. Initially, the console was only sold in New York City and San Francisco as a test market. The console would go on to have a wide release in early 1994 and by the end of that year would achieve reported sales of 100,000 units. Initial reactions to the console itself upon its release were very mixed. Many in the gaming press praised the console's power but also critiqued the lack of games available. Cybermorph was the packing game, and while it showcased the potential of the Jaguar, very few of the launch titles for the console convinced gamers to actually invest in the platform. Early release titles like Trevor McFur in the Crescent Galaxy, Raiden, and Evolution Dino Dudes reviewed very poorly. Atari attempted to redirect the ship, paying gaming publishers to bring their games to the platform. Alien vs Predator, Tempest 2000, Wolfenstein 3D, and Doom were the highlights of the console's first year release, but it simply wasn't enough. By early 1995, Atari dropped the console's price to $149.99, but gamers were already looking ahead to the US release of Sony's PlayStation and the Sega Saturn. Console sales never picked up, and this was noted in Atari's 1995 annual report, which stated, Jaguar sales were substantially below Atari's expectations, and Atari's business and financial results were materially adversely affected in 1995 as Atari continued to invest heavily in Jaguar game development, entered into agreements to certain published licensed titles, and reduced the retail price for its Jaguar console units. Atari attributes the poor performance of Jaguar to a number of factors, including extensive delay in development of software for the Jaguar, which resulted in reduced orders due to consumer concern as to when titles for the platform would be released and how many titles would ultimately be available, and the introduction of competing products by Sega and Sony in May 1995 and September 1995, respectively. At the end of 1995, the Jaguar had reportedly not even put a dent in the US console market, and Atari was hit by major layoffs. It's widely reported that the console only sold 125,000 units in its lifespan, with Atari still holding 100,000 units in stock they simply couldn't get rid of. The company began liquidating that stock of consoles, and reportedly game developers who were still making games for the platform were left with no communication from Atari around this time. By the end of the console's existence, around 50 games were officially released for the platform, 15 of which were released for the ill-fated Jaguar CD add-on. Atari Corporation would merge with GTS Inc. in April 1996, and the Jaguar was dead in the ground from there. JTS had no interest in remaining in the video game hardware space. In 1998, JTS sold the Atari name and properties to Hasbro Interactive. Atari as it was dead, but the brand would live on as a new entity. After releasing Doom in the back end of 1993, id Software were keen to bring the game across to consoles. Atari though were desperate for Doom to come to their platform. In the end, they paid id Software $250,000 to make it happen. When speaking about why Atari's Jaguar was chosen to be the home of console Doom, Jay Wilbur stated on the id Software blog that the price points of the Jaguar made it likely to sell well, and that the team at id Software felt programmability made it an ideal platform for Doom. John Carmack himself stated, I was slated to do a cut-down version of Doom for the Super Nintendo SFX chip, but kept thinking how cool a Jaguar version of Doom would be, and Nintendo kept rejecting Wolfenstein SNES for a bullshit reason. A Golden Cross bonus item might offend Christians, right? The console port was almost entirely overseen by John Carmack personally. Sandy Peterson even jokingly stated to Carmack that the Jaguar port was Carmack's reward for doing such a good job with the PC release. Good job, now you can go play with your new toys, he reportedly told Carmack. Carmack revealed during a 1994 interview with Edge magazine that he had a very primitive version of Doom running on Jaguar hardware within 2 weeks of signing the deal, although he did describe the performance of that build as wretched. Writing about the developments of Jaguar Doom on June 29, 1994, Sean Green stated, Jaguar Doom will run at 160 by 180. The main reason is speed. With 320 by 200 res, we could have gotten 20 frames per second in some places, 15 in most. With 160 by 180, we get 20 all around. As far as the cache architecture goes, I don't think the res lowering is directly related. Regarding why no resolution toggle as in the PC version, the reason the PC has it is because the hardware it can be played on varies in speed and processing power. All of the Jaguar boxes are the same. Isn't developing for consoles great? Smiley face. In regards to John Carmack, he originally was a huge fan of the Jaguar console. Speaking in Edge in early 1994, he stated, I honestly think it's, Jaguar, the best designed video game hardware I've ever seen. When I first heard about the Jaguar, I groaned at the thought of Atari designing its own processors. Think they would mess it up for sure. It turns out that I like the chip architecture better than anything I've worked with. They're great to program. However, John Carmack's feelings about the Jaguar hardware shifted greatly as the project continued. By the end of development on Doom for Jaguar, his tone soured significantly. In the year 2000, he commented about the Jaguar was definitely significantly hampered by its technical flaws, which kept me from ever being too big of a Jaguar booster. I was proud of my work on Wolf and Doom, more so than just about any other console work it has been involved in, until just recently, but in the end, the better consoles won the war. Interestingly, Carmack updated the id Software blog in the back end of 1994 as he was developing both the Sega 32X and Jaguar ports concurrently, indicating that he knew even then the Jaguar port would be superior. The Jag has a lot of speed in it, you just need to sweat a bit to get at it. In contrast, the Sega 32X is less powerful but very easy to get the speed. They have a GCC compiler for the SH2 chips. Doom will be showing up on both the Jag and the 32X. The Jag version will be a bit better, but it will have over twice the man hours put into it. John Romero was also critical of the Jaguar in the years after Doom's release, telling a user that asked if Quake was ever targeting a Jaguar release, "Practically speaking, there's no way the Jaguar could have done it. It could barely handle Doom." Helping Carmack to code Jaguar Doom was Dave Taylor, who would reportedly help with various aspects of writing Jaguar Doom's codebase. Taylor largely focused on multiplayer coding as well as various systems within the game engine, like MIDI playback. One of the biggest omissions from the Jaguar version of Doom was the lack of in-game music. When discussing this in a 2014 interview, he stated, "I have no idea why I didn't play during the game. I remember writing the MIDI sequencer and getting it working after learning a lot about the quirks of MIDI files. It's clearly been too long. It sounds to me like I must not have gotten the load low enough, so John probably killed the music during gameplay and just did it during intermissions where it wouldn't hurt performance." Maybe he remembers, "The Atari Jaguar was my first experience porting a game to console and I found the whole affair pretty traumatic. Music was present on the cartridge, however it's been stated that the digital signal processor, DSP, was needed for other essential operations within the game and thus was not able to be used for playback of the MIDIs without impacting the overall performance of the game." In the years since the game's release, hackers and coders have gone digging into the Jaguar code and found that, with a little more time, it's likely that Carmack and Taylor could have fully implemented music. Jaguar Doom required a lot of work to run at a playable and stable frame rate. Levels were modified and reduced in complexity, reducing the strain on Jaguar hardware. Textures had to be replaced and reduced in variety for similar reasons. The game's resolution was cut, while several monsters were taken out of the game completely. They were able to port over most of the original Doom's levels in some form, and several new ones were created by the team at id Software specifically for this version of Doom. This includes a new Hell's Keep level. Support for the multiplayer came through the Jag link. This would require two Atari Jaguar consoles to be linked together with a cable, with two copies of the game, allowing for deathmatch and cooperative play. Performance was a key discussion point during the development of this version of Doom. Carmack himself observed that the engine wasn't built for the Jaguar specifically and thus could not take advantage of the hardware to its fullest potential. That being said, Carmack was very proud of what he was able to achieve and commented in September of 1994, "Alien vs Predator made very different choices than I did. They have a lot more pixels on the screen, but it runs slower, about 12 frames per second, and the engine is a lot more limited. The engine is essentially the level of Shadowcaster on PC. 90-degree walls, transparent sections, floor ceiling texture mapping, strictly diminishing light and a rear clipping plane. They chose to use a higher resolution bitmaps, so they have less variety." With Atari keen to have Doom released for the holiday period, the game was released on November 28, 1994. It's important to keep in context when talking about this port. 35 frames per second was never on the table, and Carmack's decision to strip down the Doom engine rather than build a custom engine for Jaguar means that it was never going to achieve that. Instead, Jaguar Doom strives for consistency, and I'd argue it hits that mark. Doom on Atari Jaguar is easily the most stable of the 1994 Doom console ports. From a performance perspective, it runs well and consistently, offering the best console Doom experience until the release of PlayStation version of Doom almost a year later. It's also important to bring up that the game runs in full screen mode, giving the player the biggest screen real estate of either of the console ports released in 1994. The cut-down levels both reduce the scale of the levels and texture variety, leading to these levels having a more uniform appearance. It doesn't steal from the gameplay, but it does make a fair few of the levels bleed into each other visually. It also, in my opinion, means some of the more visually striking rooms in this version of Doom lack the punch that they did on PC version. The limited resolution can make the game look a lot more blocky than its PC counterpart, and enemies in the distance can be harder to distinguish because of this. Textures in the distance take a notable dive in quality, blurring and smudging more obviously. But all this was the price of getting Doom onto the Jaguar console, so it's one that gamers I assume were very happy to make back in 1994. The missing levels are also a slight disappointment, and the lack of Cyberdemon and Spider Mastermind robs the game's finales of the grandeur that they deserve. Instead, this version sees proceedings end in the Fortress of Mystery level, which I'm not the biggest fan of as it just isn't a good level. Several new versions of levels are included though to try and fill the gaps. A new version of Tower of Babel sees the player takes on waves of enemies in a small arena, while Inferno's first level, Hellkeep, gets a complete overhaul, for better in my opinion. Unlike the 32X version of the game, this version does include the Inferno episode. Many of the levels in this version have been radically tweaked or had segments replaced or removed, but the levels by and large make the jump to Jaguar Doom. There are also 24 levels in this collection, comfortably outnumbering the 32X version for quantity. The Jaguar controller is a very unique beast, and the lack of ability to fully customize control scheme means you're stuck with what the developers deemed as acceptable. Personally speaking, I'm not the biggest fan of the Jaguar port's controls. I find them a bit cumbersome, but at the same time I also accept that they did the best they could with the beast they were trying to tame. Strafing is in this version, and the enemies all have their sprites, so ThatNukemGuy feels a bit stiffer to move around in this version compared to the PC, but you'll get used to this after a few minutes of gameplay. One key aspect of this port that does take away a lot from the experience is that lack of background music. Bizarrely, the decision was made to have the music that should have been in the background of each level playing the intermission screen at the end of each level, meaning this is the only way you can actually listen to the Jaguar soundtrack in-game. Some people may view this all as a non-issue, however I feel that music is a key component of Doom, and a lot of the atmosphere is lost without some form of music. I accept this is a technical shortcoming and was forced on Carmack and Taylor by the tight time constraints that were placed upon the project. If you're curious what those tracks would have sounded like, here is a sample overlaid onto some gameplay for you. It's not a complete deal breaker for me, but it does leave this version of Doom feeling the most lonely of all the console experiences. Sound effects are here though, and all of them are recognisable from the PC version of Doom. They aren't as high quality as the PC version, but that's to be expected, and they're all recognisable, so it's better than nothing. This version also includes a multiplayer mode that allows two players to face off in deathmatch or play cooperatively. Unfortunately, I have never played Jaguar Doom in this way, but looking online, it seems that the experience isn't all that bad. Reportedly, the experience can be hampered by glitches and issues though. The inclusion of multiplayer was a big deal, as the Sega 32X version completely omitted support for multiplayer modes entirely. While official sales numbers for Jaguar Doom aren't publicly available, one can assume that Doom would have been among the system's top sellers. The Jaguar itself only sold in the region of 125,000 units across its life though, so that doesn't paint a positive picture for actual game sales. Jaguar Doom would live on more through the Doom series. The levels edited for this version would appear in the 32X version of Doom, as well as PS1, 3DO, Sega Saturn and Game Boy Advance versions of Doom 1. The Jaguar port is generally considered one of the more impressive 1990s Doom console ports and has amassed a cult following in the years since it touched down. In 2003, the source code for this version of Doom would be released officially by id Software and Atari Age. The code remains available to this day, however it is not to be used for commercial products. The Jaguar level set was last officially used in the early 2000s and since has never officially featured in any of the modern re-releases. You can access versions of a level through the WAD storefronts in Doom 1 plus Doom 2, but these are less than optimal experiences. The sad thing about Jaguar Doom is that it's more important as a historical piece of Doom legacy rather than a piece I would recommend going back to visit yourself. It's clear that Carmack and Taylor worked as hard as they could to bring Doom to Jaguar, but the reality is that even id Software knew the platform was doomed from the outset. The choice of consoles around this time wasn't suited to Doom, so Jaguar ends up being a great port that barely anyone played during its release time. And that's a bit of a shame because I think the port that they created here is very good. Of course there's going to be performance issues, and of course there are going to be shortcomings, but if you were looking to play Doom on a home console, this was the best way to do it in 1994. The end result is a very impressive and fun Doom port. Its lack of music though is a killer for me personally. I also feel that future console ports improve on this level set in such a way that returning to visit this particular version is mostly needless outside of historical curiosity. It was very impressive for the time, and if people experienced this in 1994, I imagine they were very happy with what they got. But outside of curiosity, I would strongly recommend playing the PlayStation version of Doom 1, as not only does that version perform better across the board, it enhances the visuals, has background music, and includes all the Jaguar Doom 1 levels. But let's be clear here, this is arguably the most important of any of the Doom console releases, and would also mark the final release on console where id Software were directly involved with development of the game. If you want to experience this, there are Jaguar emulators out there, and there's also a dedicated source port that works to emulate this version of Doom specifically called Calico. And that's the story of Doom on Atari Jaguar.